Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. No one in the world suspects that at a moment's notice, I can become mighty Green Lantern with my amazing powering and invincible green beam. Golly, what a feeling it is. That was 1960. 10 years later, Green Lantern would be getting tunked on the head by a can of beans thrown by his supposed superhero buddy, Green Arrow, who 10 years earlier looked like this. So how did comic book characters, and by extension America itself, go from an image like this in the early 60s, representing science and technology, the Kennedy years, will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, to an image like this, representing the end of the 60s, the death of the counterculture? This great page comes from this series that debuted in 1970 with this senses-shattering image, and has since gone on to be considered one of the greatest comic book series of all time, illustrated by the one and only Neal Adams, who passed away last month, and since then I've been doing memorial webinars in his honor. My name is Arlen Schumer. I did a book about comic book art in the 1960s called The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, about Neal Adams and 7 other great American artists, not just comic book artists. There's the table of contents, and you can see that I tried to match up a quote from each one of the men from past interviews that kind of summed up what their art was about. And look at what Neal Adams says: we're telling stories. Some people think we're creating art. Remember that quote, because we're going to come back to that quote at the end of this webinar. When you get to each artist's introduction, I give you a double-page spread with a kind of a portrait of one of their most or the most well-known character they're associated with. And then on the right side, I ghost behind my type of the written introduction an image that also is kind of summing up of their career. So you can see when I take away the type, there is a black and white engraved into the silver version of this poster Neal Adams did in the early 70s, I believe, with the main DC Comics characters he's known for. Of course, Batman, the Spectre. There's Green Arrow. And sitting on top of Dead Man's head, Dead Man, that's the character Neal Adams made his bones with in the late 1960s, although he didn't create Dead Man. Here's the half-page house ad in the fall of 1967, beautifully lettered, by the way, by the great Irish Snap, who was the letterer behind the DC Bullet, the Comics Code Seal, and every logo you could think of, pretty much. But what an odd-looking character, Dead Man. This man who was just murdered is our hero? Well, if you were buying and reading DC Comics, you knew this was the work of their great artist, Carmine Infantino, mostly known, of course, for being associated with the great super speedster, The Flash. By the way, only in comics would a guy named Carmine, which means red, of course, be associated with the most noticeable red-suited character. But I digress. Infantino was like the Jack Kirby of DC Comics. You can see behind the type on the right all of the characters he was associated with for, over a decade by 1967, when Dead Man would prove to be his last feature. But what a feature it was. He was a circus acrobat who performed without a net, but this time he's shot midair. He lands on the ground, beautiful stylized panels by Infantino. But instead of being dead, he rises up. He's alive. He goes towards the light. Oh, I love that panel, vertical. And then he goes outside the circus tent, and suddenly in the middle of the thunder and lightning and rain, a tree speaks to him. I, Ramakrishna, speak but once. Boston Brand, you shall have the power to walk among men until you have found the one who killed you. So this was a kind of reincarnation meets The Fugitive, if you know my Fugitive reference. But as great as this debut was, the artist who co-created him with the writer Arnold Drake was no longer able to draw Dead Man. He was being, in a sense, forcibly retired from drawing full-time to become the first comic book artist ever to be promoted to an executive position. You would think in a visual medium like comics, of course it makes sense. You know, Joe Quesada at Marvel Comics has been there for 15 plus years, I think. He's a great artist. But Infantino was the first. And not only was he initially just sort of like the art director of all of their covers, he was made an executive because the head of DC, Irwin Donenfeld, son of Harry, one of the founders with Jack Leibowitz, thought that the covers sold the comics, and Infantino's covers sold the most at DC. So Irwin Donenfeld basically said, I want you to do all the covers for DC. And within a year, he went from kind of art director to publisher. And there he is, probably sketching out cover ideas. So his other kind of mandate was to bring in new ideas and new talent to DC to ward off all that was happening in Marvel Comics, the competition. This is a half-page house ad that appeared at the same time as Dead Man, fall of '67, announcing, look, what's going on? They're working around the clock. Oh, did I mention Infantino drew this? Could it be new artists, new titles? Big thing, new things are coming from DC. Well, could it be new artists? Yeah. Just, you couldn't make the timing better. 26-year-old Neal Adams, although this was probably shot in the early 60s, closer to when he was 21, and the youngest artist ever to be given a nationally syndicated comic strip called Ben Casey, which was based on an ABC television medical show at the time. And Neal Adams was chosen because of his photorealistic drawing that was honed by learning how to draw from photographs. You can see the Polaroids Neal took of both himself posing as Ben Casey, played by, what was his name, Vince Edwards, I think, and even using his first wife, Corey, at the time. You can see the photos in the upper right became that middle panel. Neal had trained in advertising art before Ben Casey that was based on using photography as reference. After Ben Casey ended in 1966, Neal went out as a full-time illustrator. This was his self-promotion piece. And I think the urban legend is his portfolio got stolen. And long story short, and I go into this in other webinars, he does wind up going to DC Comics in 1967, just in time to take over Dead Man from Carmine Infantino. This is the third issue of Dead Man, but Neal's second issue and his very first cover. And man, it was this cover that blew everybody's minds. Nobody we had ever seen draw that many faces of that many genders and races, ethnicities. And it was Neal's facility with realistic human faces and emotion that in these panels here, as I'm talking and you're reading the dialogue, you can feel the dialogue's intent by the way Neal's ability to draw facial expressions. I mean, Dead Man doesn't have pupils. He's wearing a mask. And yet Neal draws him crying. So you can feel that dialogue.
I mean, Neal's facility with facial expressions. Again, here's a character wearing a mask, and yet you can feel this dialogue, even if you have no idea what it's about. But it was because of Neal's realism that the writers he was collaborating with, first Jack Miller, a longtime romance comics editor, but these were like film noirs and the kind of stories that Neal's realism was able to facilitate. I mean, folks, this is early 1968, and this is a story about Mexican, immigrants illegally coming over into the United States, meaning this could have been written and drawn yesterday. But it was Neal's realism in this particular story, and you can see his very cinematic storytelling ability and with figures, and you can sense what's going on here. Dead man's in the body of this guy trying to save the guy underwater, and you can see what happens when the rope comes up, and you turn the page and just look at the beauty of this one panel in terms of all the elements that make up a great piece of comic art. Everything from the naturalism of the figures, the lighting and shading, the beautiful stylized coloring, the monochromatic green against the pink, and the simplicity of the dialogue, and knowing that that's Dead Man in that figure and what he's feeling. And Neal doesn't even show you his expression, but you can feel this panel. You can feel Dead Man's disappointment at failing. Dead Man's stories didn't have happy endings usually. He was frustrated, and you can feel that. And then he hits you with this combination of realism and stylization. And that's the key to Neal's art and why he was able to do the work we're going to see tonight in Green Lantern, Green Arrow. So Neal was a happy boy, but he really wanted to draw Batman. I mean, this is the Batmobile he drew when he was 10 years old. He went to Julius Schwartz, the editor of the Batman titles, and said, let me draw Batman for you, Julie. But Julius Schwartz said, sorry, Neal, I'm already committed to the artistic genius of Irv Novick. Now, no offense to Irv Novick, but hey, he was already committed. This is the spring of '68. So what does Neal do? He goes to Murray Boltinoff, another DC editor. And one of his titles was called Brave and Bold. And it was the Batman team-up title. Every month, every issue, he would meet another DC character. And you can see that the art by DC journeyman Bob Brown was, this is what the issue looked like before Neal convinced Murray Boltinoff to let him team up Batman with Dead Man, because he was already drawing Dead Man. So in the summer of '68, dated September, but on sale in June, July, was this issue. We had never seen a Batman like the man inside the bat mask, like we started to see from this very first cover. I mean, Batman starts out in 1939, drawn by Bob Kane, looking like this. But over the course of the 1940s, that morphed into this bizarre grotesquerie with the Dick Tracy square chin. And even though in the 1960s, Carmine Infantino modernized that version of Batman, it was basically this version that was translated to television with the Adam West Batman. And even by the time the show ended in the spring of '68, the comic book Batman still resembled Adam West. So it was a bit of a shock when we saw panels like this of the man inside the Batman mask. But if you were reading Dead Man, we were used to that already. So in one issue, Neal Adams, in a sense, recreated Batman. And if you've seen my Batman webinars, I'll be posting them on my YouTube or Vimeo channels very soon after this webinar. But I go into what Neal did almost single-handedly over the course of the next year. every issue of Brave and Bold, teaming Batman up would be another artistic triumph for Neal. Great stories by DC veteran Bob Haney. I mean, how could Batman possibly meet Sergeant Rock in World War II? But man, they pulled it off. But it was a year later, in the summer of '69, that Neal Adams and Bob Haney gave us this new Green Arrow, a superhero with a goatee. We were used for the last, decade plus of this being Green Arrow, drawn by the great Mike Sekowsky of Justice League of America fame. But Green Arrow was essentially a carbon copy of Batman. There's his Robin called Speedy, and there's his Commissioner Gordon, just like Batman and Robin had their Commissioner Gordon. Batman had his Batmobile, and yes, Green Arrow had his Arrow car. But man, what a shock this issue was that summer of '69. And in just one of so many great pages that Neal penciled and inked, he explains, my other identity is Green Arrow. I'd almost forgotten it. It's been some time, like something from another life. I haven't even gotten any use out of this new costume I had made up. That was Neal basically going back to the pop culture source of Green Arrow, which was Robin Hood, and Errol Flynn's Robin Hood being one of the most pop culturaliest, if I'm mangling a phrase there. But the other thing about this issue and this very kind of, I don't want to say hippie look, but compared to what was happening at the time, I mean, the same time this issue came out, Life magazine summing up the 1960s came out, and it was these images of the 60s from sources like Life magazine and headlines like this that summed up the decade. The assassinations, Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, the Vietnam War, the counterculture war that opposed it, images etched in our mind. This changed our very conception of what a hero was. I mean, according to Life magazine, before the 60s, it was the cowboy. That was exemplified by John Wayne. But in 1967, Warren Beatty created the first countercultural gangster film by making the villains the heroes. It was the outlaws as the heroes. In the same year, 1969, that Green Arrow debuted. You had Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You had the urban cowboys of Ratso Rizzo and John Voight there. What was this character's name? I forget. And then, of course, also in 1969, the same year Neal Adams' Green Arrow debuts, you get Easy Rider with its lead character, Peter Fonda, calling himself Captain America. Because Captain America, I mean, here he is in 1964 or 5 actually fighting in Vietnam. It was the Marvel Comics characters that were the darlings of the counterculture. They were the ones appearing on Rolling Stone in 1969. They were the ones being written about in all the hip magazines of the day, not DC Comics. DC Comics was the establishment compared to Marvel. Anything hip was happening at Marvel. Look at the way John Romita's Spider-Man is handling the campus movement in late 1968. This is dated January 69. The very next month, though, look at how DC Comics handles, the movement. DC was like the establishment, over 30 types that were trying to be hip, but DC couldn't compete with the onslaught of Marvel Comics. The first major media coverage of them and the infamous, there's a story to this article, but superheroes with super problems. The idea that the DC Comics characters were perfect, were idealized caricatures, whereas the Marvel heroes were more down to earth and realistic. Well, when Carmine Infantino stopped drawing full-time and became the publisher of DC Comics, he basically started to say with the covers and characters and situations, you want superheroes with super problems? Okay, how about dying? Is that enough of a problem for you? Within a year or two, when Carmine Infantino took over, I would call these covers heroes crying and dying. Almost every DC superhero, as they were slipping in sales in the post-Vietnam era, Infantino chose to kind of kill them off. All of their great artists were leaving the titles at the same time. It was the kind of the end of an era. Gil Kane wasn't drawing the Atom anymore. This was a Mike Sekowsky cover, I think one issue before the title was canceled. And look at Green Lantern. Also, without Gil Kane, you have the awkward art of Mike Sekowsky. But yes, Green Lantern was dying. Green Lantern was literally drying up. This is December of '68. Well, Neal Adams gets wind. Look, Gil Kane, they got him to do one cover. Look at the issue, number 75, dated March 70. Well, Neal Adams found out that they were going to cancel Green Lantern. So he went to Julius Schwartz and said, listen, I love Gil Kane's Green Lantern. Why don't you let me draw him for a few issues just to get it out of my system, and then you can cancel the title. Now, I'm not sure if it's ever been put on record whether it was Neal that suggested they team him up with Green Arrow because of the color green, but you know, this Green Arrow got a lot of attention. So we're not sure whether it was Neal, whether it was Julius Schwartz, but the other ingredient, they said, oh, Julius Schwartz basically gave it the thumbs up and said, okay, how about if we get Denny O'Neil to write it with you? Well, Denny O'Neil was the hot sort of counterculture writer at DC, you know, kind of the equivalent, I would say, of Roy Thomas over at Marvel. But along with Neal, they were the young firebrands at the company. And Denny O'Neil was already writing for Julius Schwartz, doing the superhero group title, Justice League of America, with covers by Neal like this one. Look, also about pollution, another issue of the time. Well, additionally, Julius Schwartz had already teamed them up on what would be a 4 or 5 year stretch of incredible solo stories in the two Batman titles, Batman and Detective Comics. So Neal got to work drawing out the first cover. And here's an aborted attempt. Again, we're not sure whether Neal rejected this, Julius Schwartz rejected it, but you can see Neal totally inked the main Green Lantern figure. But there is the black and white original art of what would become this landmark cover. Out of all the great covers Neal Adams did at DC, and boy, did he do, you know, this has to be in the top 10 just for what I called senses shattering impact. And then you opened it up to this incredible splash page, which if you know your Park Avenue South, New York City, I can tell that's where Neal got photo reference, but still just a masterful splash page on all levels where Neal's trademark realism, combination of perspective and foreshortening, knowledge of anatomy on the Green Lantern figure, and then even the design of all the caption boxes leading your eye down. It's really just a magnificent cover followed by a magnificent splash page. So there he is patrolling the city, and he sees a portly businessman being pushed around by some young toughs, as they're called. So Green Lantern does his ring thing. And as we follow the story along, you all right, fella? Just fine, Lantern, thanks to you. But another second, that kid might have hurt me. You're my kind of guy, Lantern. More guys like you, this whole world be a better place. Hey, superhero. And like dialogue from the Batman TV show, there's no need to thank me, people. I was just doing my duty. And he gets tonked by a can of beans. What the? Green Arrow, you're defending these anarchists? Can't you see they're breaking the law? Yeah, I can see lots of things. Like, you know business here. I was almost tempted to throw a can on you myself. You know, I always thought it was Green Arrow that threw the can. I guess he didn't. You're not making sense, Green Arrow. No, come on. I'll give you a guided tour. Look at how the other half lives, if you can call it living. And only Neal's mastery of realism could pull off the next page as we're taken through a tour of a tenement building that the portly businessman was the landlord of. And Green Arrow kind of schools him as you're reading the dialogue, as I'm talking. And they go up to the rooftop as Green Arrow continues to school him. Listen, like what you've seen, I hope you enjoyed playing super out there. I hope it did a lot of good for your ego. Hey, easy. You've no cause to yell at me. I have a job and I do it. Seems I've heard that line before at the Nazi war trials. And then we see a voice coming from off screen, off page as we turn it. And I'm going to build this scene for you because you see an elderly black man on the rooftop. I've been reading about you, how you work for the Blueskins and how on a planet someplace you helped out the Orange Skins and you've done considerable for the Purple Skins. Only there's skins you never bothered with. The Black Skins. I want to know how come. Answer me that, Mr. Green Lantern. I can't. I'm not sure Neal Adams ever forgave the colorist for coloring Green Lantern's gloves yellow, but people always think, Neal told me when I was working for him, that people thought he had photo reference for that incredible center panel shot. And Neal said, nope, made that up out of my head. But man, I would crave for reference like that. But that shows you his ability to draw. And this is one of the most incredible triptychs in comic history. It literally brought Green Lantern down to earth. You turn the page, and we see the ghostly head of the Guardians that give Green Lantern his authority and power. But Green Arrow interrupts. That's right, Lantern, apologize, grovel in front of that walking mummy. You call yourself a hero, chum? You don't even qualify as a man. You're no more than a puppet. And the Guardians pull your strings. A couple of years ago, Abraham Reisman wrote this article online for Vulture. The moment when superhero comics got woke. Yes, indeed. And it was Adams and O'Neil's Green Arrow that was doing the waking. Listen, forget about chasing around the galaxy. Remember America. It's a good country, beautiful, fertile, and terribly sick. There are children dying, honest people cowering in fear, disillusioned kids ripping up campuses. On the streets of Memphis, a good black man died. In Los Angeles, a good white man fell. Something is wrong. Something is killing us all. Some hideous moral cancer is rotting our very souls. And you sitting on your mud bowl, preening like a smug tomcat. How dare you presume to meddle in the affairs of humanity when human beings are no more than statistics to you and your crew? How would you advise us? That's easy. Come off your perch. Touch, taste, laugh, and cry. Learn where we're at and why. Look at that great facial expression that Neal gives Green Arrow. I feel there is wisdom in your words. There is wisdom. For a week, the galactic immortals argue and debate. And you can see what happens. Green Lantern of Earth, I have a proposition for you. Look at Hal Jordan. He goes, I could switch to Green Lantern and fly us. Pal, we're going to play it strictly human, remember? There's a fine country out there someplace. Let's go find it. Three set out together, moving through cities and villages in the majesty of the wilderness, searching for a special kind of truth, searching for themselves. Now, this issue comes out around January of 70. which means Neal Adams and Denny O'Neil drew it sometime in the fall of '69. I'm not sure exactly when, but that was the year of Easy Rider. And look at the poster and its slogan. A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. Whether this was an influence on Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams, but it was certainly one of the most impactful movies of the year. But what Neal said is, and this is what gives me reason that it was his suggestion to include Green Arrow with Green Lantern, this is what he said, by making Green Arrow into a cool Robin Hood, I had served him up as an anti-establishment foil to counter Green Lantern's conforming, status quo worshiping, white do-gooder, blind, kind of 1950s creep attitude. Social consciousness was the name of the particular game then, and Green Arrow became the focus of that surge. By the way, the cover has become an icon. The stamp was issued maybe about a dozen years ago. And boy, the parodies that have come out in the 50 years plus since, even Neal Adams himself did an homage cover, switching the characters around. There's the second issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And interesting how this cover developed. Look at the original sketch. Now, this looks like either the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, or it's part of an 8.5 by 11. But look at the cover as Neal originally penciled it and mid-inked it. But once again, whether he rejected it or Julius Schwartz rejected it, Neal put a lot of work into this cover, but ended up penciling and inking this one, which would become one of the great pink purple covers that DC Comics in the 60s loved to do. So this story takes place in, I believe, up in Minnesota. And this particular story, Journey to Desolation, dealt with a mining town, and you can see in the dialogue here some of the sense of the kind of union situation. And there's, of course, Neal doing Bob Dylan. By the way, inked by Frank Giacoia. Not exactly a great match, but a serviceable job. And you can see the kind of era Neal was drawing from. But it was really the third issue that was pretty intense. It brought back the character Black Canary that would become the love interest of Oliver Queen / Green Arrow. But this particular issue about Black Canary being part of a family, and the family run by Joshua. Well, yeah, who does he look like? Now, this issue is appearing in the middle of 1970, and it was, of course, in the summer of '69. This issue of Life dated December, when I think the trial started for Charles Manson. But this issue, the next issue, that was happening in 1969, was when Native Americans took over Alcatraz and declared it Native American property, dating back hundreds of years. And it was issues like this appearing in 1969 that would influence the direction and the issues that O'Neil and Adams would embark on. So you can see right away we're in Native American country. And Neal's mastery of human anatomy and facial expressions, and of the ability to draw different races and genders. This might be the first realistic drawing of a Native American in a mainstream comic book. But also, as you're reading the dialogue, these were all things that the Native Americans in 69 were putting forth in their list of issues. But how about Green Lantern's dialogue? Folks, this is 52 years ago, and it could have been written yesterday. I guess you have to learn the things I'm ashamed of about my race. This is what's called being woke. The media took notice of what was happening with titles like Green Lantern, Green Arrow. In the October 19th, 1970 issue, they have an article called The Radicalization of the Superheroes. And of course, in the issue, in addition to talking about Marvel Comics, they really feature Green Lantern, Green Arrow, especially this particular issue, the very next issue in our discussion. What the three of them bound in some kind of interplanetary court. Well, if you were up on what was happening in America in 1968 and 69, you remember the Democratic Convention in 68, in which the police basically rioted and ran roughshod. You sound familiar? i.e. Black Lives Matters. But yeah, 1968. And of course, the powers that be at the time blamed the protesters and brought up the famous Chicago 7. Now, there's really, David Dellinger was the lawyer, and the seventh that was missing, by the way, famous Abby Hoffman, of course, Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden. There's Judge Julius Hoffman. And the seventh defendant that was missing was Bobby Seale, shown on the right, one half of the founders of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California in 1966. And that's Huey Newton on the left. And there is, oh wait, so I got them right? I'm not sure. But there's Bobby Seale outside the courtroom. And he was so vociferous and vocal during the initial trial that Hoffman was actually able to demand that he be bound and gagged during the trial. And since there was no television or photography, we only have this courtroom drawing to show you the reality of what that must have been like. And that is the source for this particular issue. Yeah, it takes place on another planet, but in using science fiction, Adams and O'Neil are able to get across their feelings about the injustice of this kangaroo court run by Hoffman. And you can see, by the way, the resemblance of Hoffman to Adams' caricature. The following issue dealt with population explosion. You know, we're talking about things like that again. This is an issue that's really never left us, but like so many other issues about the earth and ecology that first sprang up in the late 60s, population explosion was one of them. And once again, they're able to use the classic science fiction trope of being on another planet, but observing details of their society that, of course, relate perfectly to what was happening on Earth at the time. So if you're reading the caption boxes as I'm talking, you can get a sense of, in one double-page spread, Adams and O'Neil lay out this society on the brink of starvation and collapse that once again feels uncomfortably timely. And again, folks, this was 52 years ago. The next issue, the Harpies are coming. The Harpies, could this be appearing in March of 71? A story about Harpies Well, of course, it was a metaphor for women's lib, which was an issue that was just surfacing. That year, 1970, Gloria Steinem made it to the cover of Time magazine, putting women's lib, as it was known back then, on the map. And you can see in these two panels how the Amazon night explains in a beautiful Neal Adams close-up. We were once a mighty sisterhood dedicated to aiding man in the struggle against hostile elements. So this issue appearing in late 70, early 71, was a year and a half ahead of Helen Reddy's I Am Woman that appeared in May of 72, the official anthem of the Nation Women's Lib movement, and a year and a half ahead of Gloria Steinem's first issue of Ms. Magazine, which brought back the superheroic Wonder Woman that DC kind of condescended to Steinem's wishes. She said, no, there's a whole Wonder Woman story, what they were doing with her. They basically turned her into Diana Rigg of the Avengers, but Steinem brought back, that's a Murphy Anderson cover, by the way. The next issue, Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Why does that villain look familiar? Pretty dramatic splash page as this weird child. Why do they look so familiar? And is that Carol Danvers, Hal Jordan's girlfriend? Yes. What's this story about? Well, why do they look so familiar? Of course, that's Neal doing Nixon and Agnew. The following issue. People thought that was a photograph of Carmen Infantino. It's not. It's the head of DC licensing. And I just blanked on his name. I'm blanking. But this particular story deals with an interesting issue. But what's interesting from an artistic point of view is if you read the credits, Bernie Wrightson is the inker over Neal Adams pencils. And there's some nice work in that issue. But again, it's about pollution and plastics and kind of the state of our society, small price to pay for progress. So these were the issues that O'Neil and Adams were dealing with. They were aware of what was happening in the late 60s, early 70s, the heroin epidemic. Both O'Neil and Adams served time volunteering in halfway houses and drug clinics in New York City. Well, Neal, sometime in 1971, knew that Green Arrow had the sidekick Speedy. And everybody knew that speed was a code word for amphetamines, for drugs. So Neal Adams sat down and on spec drew a cover ahead of time that would hopefully convince first Julia Schwartz's editor and then the publishers to go ahead with what became, I wish I had a copy of any of the prelims for this, but we don't. But there is what became the famous cover of Speedy revealed to be a heroin addict. And right from the start, this particular issue was special. I want you to notice, by the way, the art. This issue, Neal inked himself, but you can see from the start, O'Neil says, some will say the following story should not be told. There'll be those who argue that such events have no place in Entertainment Magazine. Perhaps they're right, but we don't think so, because we've seen these noble creatures, human beings, wrecked, made less than animals, plunged into hells of agonies. We've seen it, we're angry, and this is our protest. Snowbirds don't fly. Well, Green Arrow's walking down the street, and these young toughs come up to accost him. Nice choreographed fight scene, typical great Neal Adams. And one guy, an Asian, as you can tell, Neal's facility with different races, shoots him with a crossbow. Great combination of realism in the bottom right panel with Neal's trademark, knowing when to exaggerate. And it's that combination of realism and the cartooning of the motion lines help you feel that arrow entering Green Arrow's chest and his utter shock about getting hit. Now, when people talk about comics or movies on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean chopping up panels to look like frames of a film. It's the way Neal is almost like a film director, taking you through the sequence, shifting camera angles. Look at the top right panel. There's no photo reference for a shot like that, folks. You've got to know how to draw. But the choice of shooting Arrow in agony from below like that, and almost every panel is just a gem of visual storytelling. But you can feel the sequence as if it were a movie that you're watching. Adams doesn't need dialogue, narration to tell a story visually and beautifully, and concluding with a great final panel. Isn't modern civilization wonderful as he passes out? Once again, folks, there's a great panel of realism mixed with cartooning, as only Neal Adams was able to do it. This issue had so many pages and panels of impact. And I'm assuming whenever Neal inked something, he also colored it, because look at the beautiful coloring on this page and the stylized interiors, the lighting on panel 3. But it's this close-up of the junkie. Let me in, I can't take the pain. Folks, I think you can feel the pain on this junkie's face by Neal's facility with human emotion. But folks, it was there in the thumbnail sketch. This is maybe 1.5 inches wide, folks. I blew it up. I know it's grainy, but you can see that even in this tiny thumbnail sketch, the essence of Neal's final artwork was there. You can feel the junkie shuddering because of Neal's mastery of human anatomy, with just the right amount of cartooning, the motion lines, to make you feel the fact that his gut was on fire. And the way Neal's able to draw Lantern's naivete combined with Green Arrow's savoir-faire. Drugs? Just great storytelling by Neal Adams visually. I mean, folks, if you can't feel this junkie's agony, and if you can't feel him, you know, as Robert Crumb would say, it's only lines on paper, folks, but what lines Neal Adams put down to make you feel a two-dimensional drawing. It feels three-dimensional. You feel the emotion. You feel the dialogue of Denny O'Neil come to life. That's what an illustrator's job is when working with a writer. And then I'm going to build these next 2 panels. Green Lantern. I still don't understand why people want to poison themselves with heroin, pills, the whole sick bag. Maybe I can throw some light on the reason, GL. It's Speedy. Say a young cat has someone he respects, looks up to, an older man. Say the older man leaves, chases around the country, gets involved with others, and ignores his young friend. Then the guy might need a substitute for friendship. He might see it and jump. And how about Green Arrow's response? Gee, Speedy, all your tail lacks is violin music. I'm touched. My stomach is. Because every time I hear a sob story, I almost lose my lunch. Wow. As we finish off this sequence, Neal gives us this incredible close-up of a drug buy. And once again, Adams' facility with being able to draw races, genders, ages, women, men, doesn't matter. We come back to the bottom left of the page. Hey, Speedy, I'm going to cook some of my special scorch your mouth chili. Can I interest you in a bowl? Oh, dear God, you are on drugs. You're really a junkie. Who else did you think I was talking about? Ah, what an ending. Recapitulating the cover itself. The cover, which has gone on to become, like so many of Neal's great covers, icons. Look, at later in the 70s, it was made into a book and record. And so many parodies. I guess this was in Mad Magazine, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe I just found this on the internet. But yeah, I mean, this cover's become an icon. Even Neal himself did a takeoff of it a couple of years ago. No, well, more than that. Because look at that DC logo. So a dozen years ago. But yeah, this was part one. And then, man, could Neal just give us something? What could he follow this cover up with? The very next issue gave us another masterpiece. It was Neal paying homage to himself from 4 years earlier. I mean, another incredible cover of faces, genders, ethnicities. I mean, this cover reminds me of Norman Rockwell's masterpiece, but Neal did it in comic book form. And look at how they touted an important message from the Honorable John V. Lindsay, mayor of New York City. And yes, inside they printed a letter to Mark Iglesias, the head of, some corporate head. But basically, it was commending DC Comics on these, the drug issues and the war against drugs. And, you know, this was not your typical comic book. And as this issue progressed, inks by Giordano this time, not Neal. He couldn't ink everything. He was the most in-demand artist in comic. But look at Green Arrow's reaction to finding out Speedy's a junkie. He lashes out. Folks, this is 1971. This is, I mean, the height of the 60s, 70s counterculture rebellion against the establishment in one single image. And again, just everything that made Neal special is in images like this. Being able, as I'm talking, and you might be reading some of the dialogue, but being able to bring Denny O'Neil's dialogue to life with such realistic human expressions, you feel Speedy's sense of helplessness in the top panel. You feel Green Arrow's sense of disgust in the middle panel. But then you get a Neal Adams trademark, the soft, sensitive side of Neal Adams, just with that awesome close-up that Giordano's inks are able to do justice to. So many panels and pages can just be excerpted for just the stunningness of the artwork. And I mean, that's incredible penciling and inking by the Adams Giordano team. How about Neal's design for this page? Folks, once again, we could get lost in the beauty of so many of these incredible pages I'm showing you. Here's another movies on paper triumph for Neal. I mean, you've got to know how to draw, folks, to be able to draw a woman biting her lip, a junkie biting his fist. No dialogue, no narration, but you feel it. How about this incredible scene? Once again, Neal's ability with different races. And how about this dialogue? The black guy goes, "You coming on strong, so you get insulted, hey? Shink's nothing compared to the names I'm called. Nigger is for openers. Then they get real poetic. But it ain't the names they call you, it's what's behind their eyes, baby. This is my reason for shooting." Folks, this is 1971. And again, this could have been written and drawn yesterday. At the time, DC Comics was trying to get hip with stories like this. Lois Lane transforming into a black woman. I am curious black, a pun on I'm curious yellow. Meanwhile, Adams and O'Neil are doing this. How about this incredible close-up of the Asian guy? And once again, here's the tiny thumbnail, probably 2 inches wide at most. Beautiful. And then we get this page where the Asian addict shoots up. And of course, it comes to this. You turn the page. Once again, this is Neal's combination of hyperrealism mixed with exaggeration, mixed with foreshortening and perspective. But the decision artistically to contrast the literally life and death of the addict dead on the floor with his addict friend alive above him, as only Neal's mastery of penciling and inking, I mean, Giordano to the inks, but, and then the decision to contrast it with a psychedelic background is Neal's exact combination that I've been stressing of realism plus exaggeration, realism plus stylization. People tend to pass Neal off, oh, you know, just like they used to say about Norman Rockwell, he's just an illustrator. But yeah, you know, there's a lot more to illustrating than just drawing. But remember this article, look at how it kicks off. Not too many people draw black people as well as I do, the white comic book artist Neal Adams says with a smile. And yes, it was around this time that Neal Adams heard through Green Lantern, Green Arrow editor Julius Schwartz that they were planning on introducing a third Green Lantern into the DC Comics universe. Now, to those of you who don't know the minutia of DC Comics superhero history, the first Green Lantern of the modern Silver Age era appeared in 1959, co-created by the artist Gil Kane. And if you know the story, Abin Sur, the Green Lantern of that sector of the universe, is dying, and he bequeaths his powers onto the Earthman that the Ring finds as being the most courageous and valorous, Hal Jordan, test pilot. So that was 1959, the birth of the Silver Age Green Lantern. Fast forward, it's March of 1967, and DC Comics introduces the second Green Lantern, Guy Gardner, who right from the start looks like a bad guy. And he'll play that kind of anti-hero role the rest of his DC Comics career. But when Neal Adams found out they were going to make a third Green Lantern, another white guy, he was aware of what was happening at the time. Marvel Comics had the Falcon in 1969, created by the artist Gene Colan, who was drawing Captain America at the time. Of course, everybody knew about Jack Kirby's Black Panther since 1966. And then in 1970, when Kirby went to DC Comics and created the New Gods, one of the New Gods was a Black character who appeared in July of 71, earlier that year. And he was called the Black Racer, a black guy on skis flying. You know, we all thought, okay, Jack, it's kind of a knockoff of the Silver Surfer. No, but the Black Racer was pretty cool. And then, of course, there was the zeitgeist of the time. You had the blaxploitation films of the early 70s. Cotton Comes to Harlem was the first one. It appeared in May of 1970. Here were the main actors of the blaxploitation movement. There was Jim Brown on the far right. Moving to the left, you have Fred the Hammer Williamson, former football player like Jim Brown. You have Jim Kelly, who would later become more well-known in 1973's Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And finally, you have, of course, Richard Roundtree as Shaft. In the music world, What's Going On by Martin Gaye comes out in May of 71. And it's probably around this time that Neal Adams says to DC Comics, you know, forget about the fact that they can't find a woman, but you're telling me the Guardians can only find another white guy? We should make Green Lantern black, the new Green Lantern black, not because we're liberals, but because it makes sense. And that was Neal's practicality. And once again, he probably drew this on spec, but there is the unused or rejected cover for the debut of this new Green Lantern. You can see from this drawing how Neal was influenced definitely by Muhammad Ali and his attitude and intensity. This is the famous 1965 heavyweight bout where he decks Sonny Liston, right? Sonny Liston. And when we come back to this cover, we can see that while the Green Lantern, Black Green Lantern character is pretty cool, maybe it was the passivity of the Green Lantern figure that caused either Schwartz or Adams himself to reject it, and instead to pencil and ink this incredible drawing, which would become this incredible cover. One of Neal Adams' greatest visual creations is the new Green Lantern of 1971. And it's interesting that 3 days after this issue came out on October 28, 1971, you got Sly Stone's There's a Riot Going On, famous album of the era. So all these things are circulating when this character makes his debut. It starts out like this, an earthquake. Green Lantern sees that there's danger, a bridge is out, a girl dangling on the edge, a guy trying to save her. He's not just any guy, he's Guy Gardner. Yeah, from 1967, Guy Gardner. Well, he's incapacitated. He's going to be bedridden for at least 6 months. What to do? But all of a sudden, the telepathic image of one of the immortal guardians. We have witnessed Guy Gardner's injury. It is our wish to designate another substitute for yourself. I concur, but who? Well, now we get Neal's trademark realism as we go to a certain urban ghetto. Look at this black guy telling the white cop that they essentially are doing nothing wrong. Once again, folks, this is 1971. 50 years later, we're still dealing with these issues, of course, and worse. But nevertheless, as Green Lantern observed, he says, that's the man you want to trust with the power ring? The finest weapon ever devised? He has all due qualifications. We are not interested in your petty bigotries. Hey, that's not what I meant. Maybe he's brave, honest, and has the right kind of mind, but it's obvious he also has a chip on his shoulder the size of the Rock of Gibraltar. But they sit down, again, Neal Adams, the trademark realism. Who else would attempt to draw white foam from an egg cream on a black man's upper lip? But Neal Adams does it. And we find out his name, John Stewart. Square John to his friends. Now, folks, I kid you not. According to Neal Adams, Denny O'Neil, the writer, wanted to originally name him Leroy Washington. And Neal Adams fought for the name change of John Stewart. And the fact that he's an out-of-work architect and not, an ex-drug pusher is another cliche that probably Adams insisted on. Notice how right away you get the attitude of John Stewart where he throws away the mask. This black man lets it all hang out. I've got nothing to hide. And as the story unfolds, it turns out there's a white racist politician running for governor. And as he gets out of his airplane, John Stewart finds a way to splash him with gasoline. And look at the dialogue. Hey, baby, haven't I seen you picking cotton someplace? And look at how right away Green Lantern reprimands him. John, you were stupid and irresponsible. So I maybe missed my aim with the power beam, and the senator got a little blackened. What's to worry about? I've been dark all my life, and I'm surviving. I don't believe you missed. Okay, I didn't. Listen, Whitey, that windbag wants to be president. He's a racist. And he figures on climbing to the White House on the backs of my people. Folks, did I mention this is 1971? And look at what the story is about and the issues we've been dealing with 50 years later. You think he's a racist? Tough. Nobody pointed you, Judge. You need a lesson. And I'm the guy who's teacher. As of now, I'm assigning you to guard Senator Clutcher. If anything happens to him, you've had it. One last thing. Don't call me Whitey. Something in that reminds me of that bit about he who was without sin casting the first stone. Whoa, how about that? Well, it turns out in the story, John Stewart saves the day just when you think he's too cocky. Turns out he knew what he was doing, but Green Lantern comes in to reprimand him. And look at how Stewart fights back. My name's Green Lantern II, remember? No, it's not. You're a disgrace to your uniform, your ring, and yourself. I warned you. And look at that bottom left panel. Steady. I don't enjoy being manhandled. And bottom line is John Stewart clears the issue and ends up, of course, earning Green Lantern's begrudging respect. I'll admit, John, your style turned me off. I was more than ready to stick blame on you. No sweat, pal. Only style isn't important any more than color. Where or when, no man can say, but rest assured, John Green Lantern Stewart will return. Ominous words. By the way, this was only one story in this particular issue. Look at the yellow burst on the middle left, plus a new light for Green Arrow. What can one man do? Well, what could possibly top that John Stewart origin story? But how about this story? Written by Elliot Maggin, a brand new writer at DC, he submitted the script to Drew Schwartz. I think it was his college thesis. Maggin, after this, went on to have a multi-decade career still going strong in Los Angeles, writing comics and novels. But this story, right away, the realism of Adam being able to draw a ghetto scene, probably had photo reference for it, but that's Adam's mastery. This particular story, I think, was reproduced from Adam's pencils because in another urban legend, I think he lost the inks in the subway. I think he had them in a folder and maybe he left the folder or dozed off something. And he kept Xeroxes, I think, of his pencils, and he repenciled the story, I think, on a light box from the Xerox, something like that. But it's also what gives the story the raw grittiness that, as you're going to see, it demands. Basically, Green Arrow comes upon a riot in a Black neighborhood in the city. And once again, Neal's facility with races and realism. Green Arrow gets knocked out. He's on the ground, and a young Black kid helps him. And then you turn the page. And once again, folks, you can see the combination of realism and cartooning in that top panel. You don't have to see the bullet entering the back of the kid's head, but you can feel it by Neal's mastery of human expression, emotion, as well as the cartooning ability to put the right motion and speed and force lines to make you feel the impact and the emotion. And just like, once again, another movie on paper, Adams, the great director, takes you through the sequence of events that follow. He gets the kid into an ambulance. You turn the page and Magan quotes A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. If people bring so much courage to the world has to kill them to break them. So of course it kills them. The world breaks everyone. And afterward, many are strong in the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. The combination of the distressed Xerox photograph of the tenement with the realism of Green Arrow's expression and emotion. You young artists out there, if you think it's hard drawing a man crying, how about a man wearing a mask? Of course, it's the portrait I had to use in my double-page spread introduction, representing Neal Adams in the Silver Age. Turns out their 13th issue, Unlucky 13, would be their last issue, but man, what an issue to go out on. A Jesus Christ analogy, strapping yourself to a plane. Well, yeah, in real life, the year before, 1970, there were protests in Seattle over the pollution being caused by the SST from France. And the protesters ended up winning. And that's why the Concorde and the SST has never been allowed to fly in this country. But also in 1970, Godspell debuted, followed by Jesus Christ Superstar, I think it's 71. So the idea of treating Christ in comics was not something that was not happening in the larger pop culture at the time. And what has to be one of Neal's single greatest drawings of all is the chance for Adams to draw Christ on the cross. In my book, I do a double-page spread where I basically tell the story of this issue in one spread. You can see that thumbnail sketch of that page is 1/4 of the size of an 8.5 by 11 piece of Xerox paper. And in the upper right, you can see in the sequence of panels what happens. The protester named Isaac, very biblical, of course, great close up on the left side, of course. He gives up the ghost and he dies. The airplane attendant says, guess he was kind of crazy. Green Lantern says, sure he was, mad with nobility, far beyond any of you or I can even aspire to. And Green Lantern's girlfriend, Carol Ferris, who is crippled in a wheelchair, remember, from our Nixon Agnew team, but she's also the aircraft owner. And she says, I suppose progress must always claim victims. Very, sympathetic point of view, right? There's Neal's mastery of human emotion, the indignity that Green Lantern feels on his face. You don't need dialogue and narration. You need a guy that can draw. And then in one fell swoop with his powering, he destroys the aircraft. What's the idea? That was a $9 million aircraft. Send me a bill. And that's how the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series ended. There would be a couple of solo stories as backups in the Flash later that year. They're kind of inconsequential for the purposes of this webinar and just for the purposes of time. I thought that it's only makes sense to kind of end it here, but the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series would really prove to bring the silver age of DC Comics as represented by Green Lantern full circle. You got the innocent, some might say naive optimism represented by Green Lantern in the early 60s. And then you have a panel like this. How often have I made that vow? And until today, I believed what I was saying. I used to speak that oath with pride, with conviction, but now I'm not convinced of anything. That was when I saw things in either black or white. Before I realized it's a gray world, nothing but gray. Folks, how far we've come from Hal Jordan saying no one in the world suspects that in a moment's notice I can be mighty Green Lantern with my amazing powering and invincible green beam. Folks, this is why we got into Vietnam. That's America saying, I'm Green Lantern. I have an amazing powering. I can police the world like Green Lantern policed the universe. But those days are gone forever. The days I was confident, certain, proud to be a servant of the Guardians. I was so young, so sure I couldn't make a mistake. Young and cocky, that was Green Lantern. That was America. And how about that incredible facial expression by Neal Adams? Well, Carol, I've changed. I'm older now, maybe wiser too. Yeah, maybe wiser. And a lot less happy. That's the state of America after the 60s. After everything that happened. Once again, folks, look at the thumbnail sketch, couple of inches tall, of that incredible facial expression that eventually winds up looking like that. And yeah, it was the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series that we've become one of the most honored series of its time. This is a 1972 half-page house ad about Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Adams and O'Neil sweeping the awards that year. In 1972, after the same year the series ended with its 13th issue, the prestigious international graphic design magazine Graphiste had a special issue on comics. And you can see that they cover Neal Adams in the caption. It says, he and Kirby are the leading comic book artists of the decade. His work, based on an advertising art background, has a marked contemporary reality and is thus attuned to the recent trend towards social relevance. There's one of his great Dead Man pages, and here's what it says. Look at the bottom. Meanwhile, Neal Adams remains the master of narrative technique. Juggling incessantly with his pictures, he often achieves remarkable effects. Remember when I told you to keep in mind this quote? We're telling stories. Some people think we're creating art. Folks, maybe the impact of Neal Adams' art was most profoundly felt not only in America on an entire generation of young artists and future visual art directors, creative people in every field, but on the other side of the pond, the impact of the realism of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow stories had to impact the great Alan Moore when he takes the kind of Captain Marvel knockoff Miracle Man and gives him a rebirth that in the early 80s would prove to be one of the first modern takes on deconstructing the superhero. Moore would follow that up in the 80s with the genre-defining Watchmen, which, along with The Dark Knight, is probably the most influential comic book series of the last 40 years, treating superheroes in a very realistic manner, dealing with the issues that are both timely and timeless. I mentioned Frank Miller, but the idea of Daredevil being a man searching for his own soul, these are qualities that made Frank Miller's bones at Marvel Comics, which enabled him to, of course, go to DC a couple of years later in the mid-'80s and create The Dark Knight Returns and its issues of superheroes and corporate governmental responsibility and how they intersect with official law enforcement and what superheroes' roles are in society could not have been possible without the ground that O'Neil and Adams broke back in 1970. And John Stewart, well, remember that last panel? When will he return? He wouldn't return for 11 years, not until 1983. In this Gil Kane cover, would DC figure out what to do with John Stewart? Don't ask me why. I wasn't following Green Lantern at that time, if it was even being published in the 70s. I think it got discontinued and didn't come back into the late 70s. But basically, they didn't know what to do with John Stewart until the 80s. But ever since then, he's become a dominant character in the DC Comics, not only the Green Lantern universe, but in DC in general. He's been animated, turned into toys, icons. Yeah, every type of John Stewart configuration. The talk of a live action and which great black actor would play him, Idris Elba. The fact that there's going to be a new Green Lantern series is all due to the residue of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series. Neal Adams, every couple of years, would return to the characters that he brought to life so beautifully and so well, like this Comic-Con catalog cover. He also did this self-homage, of course, to his own work. And there would have been no Arrow universe of the last dozen years if it wasn't for Neal Adams' Green Arrow. Denny O'Neil would go on to have one of the most successful careers in comics as a writer, creator, and editor. But there's Neal's portrait of him from 1970 being used for his special issue of Alter Ego. Denny O'Neil died a few years ago, but there is how he used Neal's artwork primarily to promote himself, speaking at conventions and the like. Here's one of their last photographs together. And in a way, they're now reunited together in their passing. And I can't think of any better way to bring this webinar to a close. Boy, right on time. The Greatest Green Lantern, Green Arrow of All by Neal Adams and Denny O'Neil. Thank you, folks. If you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, you can go to my subpage on comic book history and get information about my Silver Age book and how to get a signed and sketched in copy by me. And my book just features so much of the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series. I mean, the story of the 60s, of the Silver Age, is embodied in those two images. The Ray Palmer Atom representing the early 60s, like I began the webinar with, and the Christ-like figure representing the end of the 60s, the death of the counterculture. Here's how I integrated the great art from Green Lantern, Green Arrow into some double-page spreads in the Neal Adams chapter with text and quotes from Neal himself. I give you a whole history of the Black superhero in American comics, starting with the Black Panther on the left, the Falcon, and then, of course, leading to John Stewart. And then I love that quote. You not only saw these superheroes as superheroes, you saw them as human beings. And I just always thought that this particular panel was so emblematic of the realism that Neal Adams brought to DC Comics, that brought them down to earth, that is such an iconic panel that I actually turned it into an illustration that I did for an invitation for my very first lecture for the Art Directors Club in New York City, called Superhero to Antihero, about comic book art in the 1960s. That was 1992. About 10 years later, for the CUNY Grad Center, I turned it into something called Superheroes in the 60s, Comics and Counterculture. That was a multimedia 4-part lecture series. And that eventually, a couple of years later, became my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. I also run a Facebook group based on the book and the era. One Facebook group just on Jack Kirby's work. And of course, one on Neal Adams, who is the biggest influence on my own illustration style, doing comic book art, but for advertising and editorial usage. One of my specialties is turning people into superheroes, but keeping the photographic look. I'm also hooked up to the commercial site TeePublic, where you can get over 125 of my illustrations on every kind of application, knick-knack, gewgaw, thingamabob you can think of. So support your local freelance artists, folks. Then there's my visual lectures and webinars page, which is linked to both my YouTube channel and my Vimeo channel, which carry videos of my webinars. My Vimeo channel has all the videos that have copyrighted content that YouTube's lawyers flag, but Vimeo's lawyers don't. So my YouTube channel looks like this now with all of my recent webinars. There's the first two Neal Adams webinars in memoriam. Speaking of which, since he passed away, I set up a series of 7 webinars. Next week's is Neal Adams' Marvel Works. And man, I tried to pick an image that would get across some of the intense, most energetic artwork of Neal Adams' career was his first couple of years at Marvel Comics. And we're going to look at that next week. So folks, all the information you ever need to come to any one of my events. Whoop. Wait a second. Let's go back one. Go to the events blog of my website, and I post all of my comings and goings with all of the URL links you'll need. So thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for being at this Neal Adams Memorial webinar. And I look forward to seeing you at next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.
And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.